Okay. Who's starting? Steve, can I count on you? Or should I have an opinion?
I am here. So yeah, you can count on me if you want. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you. So this chapter 2 on wicked liberty, is, I think, one of the most, well, it's one of the longest chapters in the book. I think one of the densest. And he makes, I think, they make some really important arguments about how history was created as a discipline, as a social science. So, you know, the argument that they're making is, first, that most of human history has been misunderstood because it's either been written in a way that doesn't give an accurate picture of the full richness of human experimentation in terms of social organization. And if histories have tended to fall into this automatic linear narrative of hunter-gatherer to agriculture to urban dwellings to state to modernity, and now we have today, those things happened, but the argument that they're making is that a lot of things happened simultaneous to those developments and in between those developments. So to assume that this is the only kind of trajectory possible is to really cherry pick the evidence. So that's the argument they make for the prehistorical period. The argument that they make for the modern period, I find even more sophisticated, because they make the argument that history as a discipline, so if we think of history as not simply stuff that happened, but the story of what has happened, then the entire discipline, as they seem to suggest, rests on some false premises that basically go back to either Hobbes or Rousseau. So in the Western tradition, pretty much Western education can be traced back to either a Hobbesian premise about society, human nature it's a war of everyone against everyone, or this Rousseauian idea that social equality once did exist, but that we have fallen from that original idea. And everything since then, if we think of leftist politics, has been an effort to try to reclaim that original Garden of Eden. That seems to be the argument that they're making, that history as a discipline has reduced people to either fighting for this false Rousseauian past that never existed, and that's kind of what leftists do, and that social science came out of that tradition, psychology came out of that tradition. Or you have the more conservative view, which traces back to Hobbes, which basically relies on this assumption that society needs a state in order to keep us all in line, because otherwise we will just return to our nasty, brutish, and ugly selves. What I found so fascinating about this chapter is the way that they handle the critique of Rousseau and Hobbes, especially the critique of Rousseau. They point out that it's very easy to make an anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist critique of Rousseau and Hobbes, this kind of automatic or easy or superficial indigenous critique. But they go a step further, and what they suggest is that European intellectuals like Rousseau, unlike a lot of anti-colonial scholars who basically contend that Rousseau was too dismissive of the indigenous peoples, and that Rousseau never really engaged with their ideas. What Wengrow and Graeber indicate is that Rousseau and others did actually engage meaningfully with Kandiaronk and a lot of the indigenous critics, but Westerners and anti-colonialists. So, and when I say anti-colonialists, I mean basically social historians, in particular anthropologists of a post-1960s generation who really go and try to read these European accounts. They read them against the grain, is the term that ethnologists will use, so that they can get the anti-imperialist critique, the read for the silences. But what Wengrow and Graeber do is say that Rousseau and Hobbes and others, Rousseau especially, really did engage with these critiques, and that the indigenous critiques of European society actually influenced in a profound way Rousseau's own writings. This I find to be an incredibly important contribution to European history, because what they set out to do is show that Rousseau and others writing in the 1700s weren't doing easily dismissive treatments of the indigenous, but were really trying to wrestle with what indigenous critiques meant about European society. And that as a result of the as a result of the indigenous critique, that Rousseau and others were forced intellectually to come up with reasoning to maintain a sense of European superiority that isn't merely dismissive, because what Wengrow and Graeber argue is that in a simplistic dismissal of the indigenous critique really creates this idea of sock puppets that they talk about, where you kind of, you rely on a caricature of the indigenous critique rather than looking at the actual text of the indigenous critique. And that's what I find so novel about this chapter, is that they show that European understandings of liberty in the 1700s were in fact shaped by earlier indigenous critiques of European notions of freedom, but that the direction that the European scholars went was one that served to justify, really politicize their own idea of their own ideas of what constituted civilization. So for Rousseau, what this meant was the indigenous critique exposed a lot of weaknesses in European society that he acknowledged. His history on the origins of social inequality exposed these inequalities. But what Graeber and Wengrow are suggesting is that Rousseau thought meaningfully of these critiques and responded in a way that allowed to preserve a sense of European superiority while also engaging with some of these indigenous ideas. So the implication here is that European notions of freedom, even the ones that were kind of that were more restrictive understandings than what the indigenous had, because of course they start with this idea of the three kinds of freedoms: the freedom to disobey, the freedom to walk away, and the the freedom to organize their lives as they see fit. Those three categories did not exist in European society in the same kind of way. And that's what the Indigenous took notice of, was the lack of all three freedoms. And as a result of that, you couldn't really have a full freedom. Rousseau's response to that was to acknowledge that, yes, civilization was not the egalitarian civilizations that it had once been, but that it could again be. And so Rousseau was trying to promote this idea of returning to an egalitarian past that may have existed, but he's talking about a past in light of what the Indigenous are telling him their past was like. So I think the implication here is that in some ways, Rousseau, in writing about European liberty, was responding to Indigenous critiques in a way that European historians have not fully appreciated, because they have tended to be really dismissive of the white colonial responses to the Indigenous, rather than seeing this as an actual dialogue. So it's in that respect that I find this a really sophisticated argument that I'm hoping historians of Europe really take to heart, because I'm not a historian of Europe. So I love the implication of the argument. I'm still not fully persuaded that the project that they identify, beginning with Rousseau, this kind of trying to understand the history of inequality, where I'm less convinced is that's the line that's the intellectual line that one should follow when trying to trace a history of social science. And the reason for that, for sort of my disquiet, is I wonder what David Graeber would think of Bacon and some of the other Enlightenment thinkers that preceded Rousseau, and where those thinkers, who are generally considered more in line with the scientific method and less with the rhetoric of revolution, where that would fall in this intellectual trajectory that Wengrow and Graeber are trying to establish. So that's where I'll open things up with that thought that I have. I would love hearing, since this is largely other than Mark, an audience schooled in European history, or more schooled in European history than I am, if they had similar thoughts on this.
I'm quite schooled in European political thought history. I actually wrote a thesis against Hobbes and Rousseau, recurring to Spinoza against the two. And what strikes me, well, many things strike me in this analysis. This is actually path-breaking about the very way we think about political philosophy. What I took for granted when studying those authors was actually that they thought like in an empty space. I mean, I carefully studied the historical context, the European historical context of Hobbes and Spinoza and Rousseau's thought, but it was just a debate inside Europe. And especially the notion of a state of nature that was the rhetorical concept all of them used to refer to raw human nature was to me just an abstract concept. What can it be a human being or a human society at its raw level without any layer of history, of power, of traditions. And so the idea of state of nature and of right of nature sounded to me like an abstract idea. And it is very important to frame it in the context of an Europe that is not the leading country of the world, that is not the most important and clever and progressed part of the world, but instead is a country, speaking of Europe as a country that is in some way correct, that just happened to be to become of mondial importance, and happened to start the globalization. Actually, the globalization of European culture started in just in the 15th century, and actually in the 16th century. That is a few centuries ago. It's a really small part of human civilization. And so this is a bath of reality. And this takes me to the concreteness of how the state of nature ideas and of the rights of man, the idea of natural rights of man came up, and actually on the idea that equality and freedom are not a European heritage, not at all. So this is important also because we are accustomed to think of great thinkers, Spinoza, Rousseau, Hobbes, and instead they are just the most successful inside a wide debate that was in Europe, and in Europe because of what the Jesuits told about what they found in other countries, and also this this fight that David also always had against the idea of the great mind, and instead putting the focus on the humus, on the larger debate, the conversations that gave birth to ideas, is very important and is another path of reality. The third thing is the most important of the whole book, in my opinion, is, and it is a part of the general war that David Graeber fought against our the most cherished and given for granted ideas of our very civilization. The seminal idea of this book is there are many possibilities in human societies, and we have to fight the myth of the noble savage, of the equality and freedom as an hunter-gatherer society reality, and the very Rousseauian idea of getting back to a simplicity that never existed. We must fight this idea because we must look for a way out of our mess, our today's mess. And the real question is why our society is so stuck and so unable to change, and not why the other ones used to be so changeable. And I think this fight against the idea of only one possibility for societies is at level with the fight against the myth of the barter that is in depth the first 5,000 years. And the myth of you have to earn a living and you need to work to live in bullshit jobs. So that's my comment and contribution. And I'm afraid we lost Gordon. Okay.
I think building on what you both said. When I was a student, I was studying mathematics, not European history. So my knowledge of history is entirely from reading on the side. But when I was probably a teenager, I read Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, where he tended to caricature philosophers in a way that's useful, but not the whole story. And I think he caricatured Rousseau from memory. He caricatured Rousseau, but didn't take Hobbes very seriously at all. But back in those days, if you walked into a bookshop, you had series of books of great thinkers, and that would have included both Rousseau and Hobbes. Now there are far many books, and the idea that you could actually have a discussion in an educational setting about great men and their ideas, I think doesn't quite sustain itself now. And that perhaps is, in those days, you could have those discussions, but they were to some extent disconnected from any decision you might make in life. So there's a whole question of whether you allow certain forms of discussion to prevent people discussing how they might change society, or whether in some cases you allow them so you can discuss things in the same ways in Behind the Iron Curtain. Certain poets were discussed at great length, but more for the hints in what they said than what they actually said. So again, it's strange either way, I think, in which what you're allowed to say and talk about. Apologies to anyone who's heard this before, but we discussed this chapter about a month ago. So, but beyond that, there's a couple of thoughts that, well, that's one thought that comes to me is, but the other thing is, when you look at the official history, you don't have the whole story. And I'm thinking of a parallel here from a couple of books. One was called, I think, Witness Against the Beast, and it's about William Blake by E.P. Thompson. And it's a brilliant book because what happened is there was an obscure sect called the Muggletonians, and they wrote down what they did, and it was found in someone's garage in South London. So for the first, perhaps not the first time, so you actually have records of what a very lower class religious sect thought and engaged with in about 1820. And the other parallel is, again, another of my favourite books is one by a professor in Bristol called Ronald Hutton, called The Triumph of the Moon, and it's a history of witchcraft in England. Now, the witches didn't like the book because effectively he said, you cannot claim any continuity going back to the past. In fact, you can't claim very much before about the Second World War. But he has a very interesting chapters on how certain ideas and complexes of ideas passed through history in the 200 or 300 years before that. Ideas of low magic, ideas of high magic, ideas of a goddess as well as a god. So what I think he was, Moon, I'll put it in the chat. What he was pointing out, I think, is in the underlayer below the official history, all sorts of ideas and concepts circulate. And they sometimes form themselves into a more coherent grouping or a set of ideas or an intellectual school. But it's a mistake to assume there's nothing in the gaps of history.
It was Triumph.
And I'm going to ask, can anyone hear me? I'm having trouble.
Yep.
Yes.
Kind of fuzzy.
No, okay, thank you. Thank you.
Maybe those who have a bad connection could turn the video off. It can help. And I will turn the
Do that, but I like if I have any. One thing I can't seem to. Okay, this sativa video. What?
We can hear you.
You can hear me.
Yes.
All right. Well, you can still hear me. Maybe I better. I was listening carefully to what Steve was saying, and I want to ask a question. I've read I hope carefully, this very long but very interesting chapter of what is, to my mind, a most interesting, challenging, and to me, innovational book. And so I'm having a great time, and I'm so grateful to Simona for having gotten me involved with this. I'm not a historian. I'm mainly I guess, a student of American literature and Italian literature and a bit German literature. So it's I'm not in any field in which I have an expertise. But my impression was, I guess I'm directing this mainly to Steve in the sense, not so much that, well, let me put it as a question. Is David Graeber saying that the stages, you know, the hunter-gatherers and then the shepherds and the planters, and that becomes cities, is he saying that this is not valid at all? I didn't get that impression, so I just wanted to make sure if maybe I haven't read it correctly. My impression was that he was saying rather that these things may come about in these ways, and not suggesting so much that there are many other ways. I mean, there's a certain logic in that sequence, but that the creation of cities, for example, does not necessarily mean oppression. That's the understanding I had. And so that seems to me very important. And what I find fascinating about this particular chapter, but about the other chapter that I read too, is that you know, he not only is giving us the how can I say, an indigenous, is that the right word, viewpoint, you know, but he takes that viewpoint, he really assumes it. And one key thing is when he says Americans, I love that. And the Americans are, you know, the real, I won't say the real Americans, but that comes from Amerigos, who was an explorer. But I mean, you know, it's a subtle polemic, and I think it's very effective. And the fact that I can't pronounce this man's name, I'm reading it now. I'd like some help with this. I'm going to call it Candiaronk or Candiaronk. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Can someone help me?
Yeah,
yes, Steve.
Yeah, I think it's Candiaronk or Condioronk.
Okay, then I'm pretty close.
Yeah.
Well, you know, this guy was tremendously important, and I love the fact that that his point of view is taken. Well, that my question is whether I've got it right on that first point, you know, that not so much that David Graeber is saying that the stages don't take place. There's a certain logic there. I mean, if you start planting, you're going to have to be stable. You're not going to go wandering around, you know, things like that. But that does not mean oppression, and that there are, I love the one example, and I'll just make this one point, that he's talking about, I don't remember exactly what American Indian nation, and he says that in some part of the year, they would be highly disciplined, top down type of organization, because that's what they needed in order to go hunting or doing, I will say, libertarian form or something. I thought that was a good example. Okay.
Yeah, I think you're right with your take on what they're arguing, and you're right that Wengrow and Graeber aren't saying that these things didn't happen, and that agriculture, he acknowledges that there are instances where agriculture led to the rise of cities, but you're absolutely right that the cities weren't necessarily, and he's got a whole other chapter later on in the book on Teotihuacan in central Mexico, where he shows, he relies on archaeological evidence to show the existence of cities that were egalitarian. And so what he's trying to suggest here is that as you said, that just because people lived in agricultural settings, just because they practiced agriculture, didn't mean oppression, although it often did, because it was often people who were enslaved who were forced to do the agricultural work. And you're also right that just because people lived in urban settings didn't mean that they were under state oppression or non-consensual hierarchy. Yeah, what they're trying to do is show the fluidity of these systems and how people could come and go between them, either across centuries or even within a calendar year, depending on seasons. And so there was not only this I guess, going in and out of these different systems over long periods of time, where people would abandon agriculture, they would abandon urban dwellings. The Maya of southern Mexico are the perfect example, as are some indigenous groups in central Mexico. Societies that came together in cities whose population would be 80,000, 90,000, 100,000. Teotihuacan was as large as, I've seen as high as 250,000. But that they would also abandon those towns if they thought that they had become too hierarchical. And so what distinguishes indigenous society from European society is this tendency to get stuck, whereas indigenous societies had practices and systems in place to help prevent that kind of social stratification, that permanent intergenerational social stratification, that in Europe, that these sorts of stratifications became more permanent. But I think what he's trying to suggest is that part of the reason he doesn't come, they don't come out and say this, but part of the reason, maybe part of the reason why they're permanent is because at this time, there was an indigenous critique that showed up the weaknesses of European society. And so the best way intellectually for someone like Rousseau to respond to this would be to come up with this false myth of progress that really is premised on this idea of technology. Basically, my read is that when history got created as a discipline in the Enlightenment, because that's, you know, just like sociology and econ, all of these disciplines can be traced back. Again, not that the Greeks didn't have history, but if we think of history as an intellectual discipline rather than just as storytelling or, you know, conveying morality tales. I think Wengrow and Graeber are saying that European historians are doing a similar morality tale about the fall of man from, you know, this original equal civilization. But I think what they're trying to argue is that in the 1700s, during the Enlightenment, as indigenous people started effectively critiquing European society, that Europeans then came up with this idea of technology being a driving force in history, and that technology is sort of outside of humans, and that force that's outside of humans is what now drives us as societies. And so for Hobbes, it would be this tendency to come under the authority of the state, because not to do that would be to reduce ourselves to our baser instincts and would create chaos and havoc. And then what Rousseau is, or the inspiration that Rousseau provided, is that his idea of history having a direction meant that what history needed to work toward is the redemption of this old fall from primitive, perfect Eden, Garden of Eden nature. And that from the start is a false premise, because it relies on an attempt to get back to something that never existed. And so it is a myth that's not only built on a false premise, but it's also built on a false metaphysics, because it suggests that the direction of history lies outside of us, and that force outside of us is better technology or more efficiency or greater equality. If you're coming from a Marxist standpoint, you can see how Leninism would fit squarely into this idea of wanting to return. So to me, it was such a rich chapter, because not only does he show how later scholars really did turn the indigenous into these characterized sock puppets, but the way that they walked through Rousseau's thinking and his argument, to me, was effective, because it was like they were exposing the kind of feats of logic he was having to go through to make this argument stick. And like a lot of arguments, rather than deal with really some of the core issues, he sidestepped it by creating this false premise about this idea of efficiency or rationality or a pure state of nature. But it's just like, if you think about what happens with creating the sacred, there's this set apart, and in this case it's technology or perfect state of nature that is the set apart, when really there is no perfect state of nature. But you can see how Cartesian dualism is going to really resonate with the kinds of ideas that Rousseau is tackling here. But I think Graeber and Wengrow would say, but the mistake is the moment you create that false Cartesian dualism, because humans are nature, nature is human. It's less important to point out where the distinctions between nature and human are, and it's more important, according to Wengrow and Graeber, to acknowledge that humans are the ones who can ruminate on these distinctions. It's not really where the distinction is, it's the process of distinguishing that makes us human, not where we draw that distinction. And that I found the most satisfying, because it shows how, from so to critique Rousseau in a simplistic way, it's easy, it's convenient to turn to sock puppet characterizations. But what the Europeans did is they basically just shifted the debate over to this, what is nature, what is human, rather than really grappling with the debate, which is, what does it mean about us that we've encountered different people on a different hemisphere? What does it mean that we're having this conversation? And though they don't go into this, I think the subtext is that yes, some European intellectuals were interested in having this discussion as process, like the discussion itself is what makes us human, but that most Europeans at this time, because of the rise of capitalism, that it was much more effective politically to just shift the debate over to, okay, you're human, but you're unnatural. And so your idea of what is natural is not our idea of what is natural. Our idea of what is natural relies on Cartesian dualism. Yours doesn't, you're wrong. And, you know, the imperialist horrors ensued from there, because they couldn't dismiss them as non-human, but they could, in this kind of intellectual construct, they could dismiss them easily as unnatural. And that's precisely what I think happened. Mark?
As everybody is agreeing, there's so much in this chapter that it's very hard to pick out a thread that will lead somewhere. But I also think that's something that David Graeber always did, was he would leave little spots for people to continue to think about. It's like homework exercises for us to continue to think for the possibilities. But the one thing that, well, there were a couple things. It struck me, you know, when they're talking about the use of the terms equality, both in Latin, but also in the natural languages, not showing up until much later. But for us in the US, this chapter is going to be crucial to decolonize our history. And it's not just the indigenous, but it's also our slavery history. And so, you know, 1493 was the doctrine of discovery. And as you were just saying, Steve, this is now, you know, you claim the indigenous are not even human, so you can take everything and be justified in doing it because they're heathen. And then from 1493 to about the time of de Graffigny's novel, that's like a 250 years of wrestling with these ideas. And there's so much similarity in the sort of legalistic mindset. So I found it very revealing that one of the indigenous people was saying, if you have self-interest, you can't have reason. And this is like self-interest a la Western style lawyer. I'm going to go back and reverse engineer my arguments, you know, because we really are better. And now I'm going to break it down. And both Turgot and Rousseau come up with these evolutionary ideas. And I'm always thinking that these evolutionary ideas, it's like a hierarchy through time. And lo and behold, surprise, we're at the top. It just happens, you know, that's where we are. So that, to me, that thread is just so liberating. And I can't begin to express how much that means in terms of our imagination being given back to us. And there are echoes here of that paper we just read with the refusal as cultural, no, what was it? Culture as creative refusal. You could have your heroic societies deciding which parts you want to keep or change. And so these phases, you know, that it's not necessarily, you know, these phases of progress, and already the term progress is ours. It's not, I mean, I really doubt that, you know, so-called, well, I have no idea, I'm not an anthropologist, but the idea of progress just seems so Western to me. And it's not that those stages are not possible. That's also part of that legalistic trend towards breaking things down and reducing things to their parts. I think Native Americans, when they have like a history of where things came from, it's going to be a story. It's not broken down into parts. It's a story about, some animal or, some spirit, but it's not going to be broken down into parts in a similar way. I mean, I shouldn't generalize, I don't know. So it's very interesting, these legalistic arguments that just keep repeating themselves. And so that we have the invention of racism is the same idea, where now the slave trade has been taken over by the Portuguese, and they have a wonderful biographer for Prince Henry the Navigator, who had the first slave auction. That was a much different kind of slavery. So now they're starting to invent the idea of race. And to me, those things are just resonating with this chapter powerfully. So I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
May I? Or Robin, would you like to say something? Okay, if I may. First, a parenthesis. I would very much like to discuss David Graeber's method that appears to me as grounded on provocation and conversation. He never thought alone. This book is written together with Wengrow. Another, I have just read an introduction to Kropotkin, Mutual Aid, written with Grubachik. I'm not sure I pronounce his name correctly. Nevertheless, this method of conversation, the method he used in Bullshit Jobs of provocating and reaping the result of the discussion that his provocation triggered, is a very political method, and it's a choice that is important to discuss, understand, and discuss. This parenthesis made just in this article he wrote with Grubachik, if I can find it. Yes, Grubachik. The start of the article is sometimes, not very often, a particularly cogent argument against reigning political common sense presents such a shock to the system that it becomes necessary to create an entire body of theory to refute it. And in this paragraph, Graeber and Grubachik are specifically speaking of Kondiaronk and the shock, the cultural shock that his evaluation of European society made on society. And they say the very idea of progress, of development, a linear development in a certain direction of history, is an attempt, a successful attempt to address this shock and to refute, not to refute, to make to make up for Kondiaronk arguments against our civilization. Before this the development of this idea of progress, actually European idea of history was more that of a fall. Jesuits interpreted the egalitarian societies, and primitive in their eyes societies they met, as a fall from a previous civilized society. And so in either way, we make an abstract image of what history was in previous time. Either it's an ideal of simplicity, or civilization we are fallen from, and or it's a war of everybody against everybody. In all of these cases, there's images have nothing real, and the very point is not whether they are real or not. They are political instruments to make affirmation on our present day society and the possibilities in it. The myth of progress, of a progress toward a more complex and inegalitarian and rich society, was an answer to the threat represented by the idea that equality, freedom before everything is possible in human societies. And freedom as what happens when you may have inequalities in wealth, but they don't mean you have they don't mean you have the power to oblige people to do what you want. The most important feature of the original American societies in Kondiaronk description was this kind of freedom, even more than equality. And then I will stop. But when I was studying my Spinoza, and my philosophical background is that of anthropological philosophy, a philosophy that makes assumptions about men. And this is one of the reasons why I love so much David Graeber, because he was not just an anthropologist, he was somebody who tried to make assumptions, general assumptions, to drive general assumptions on the basis on the anthropological findings. I had a discussion with a friend of mine that was a real anthropologist, she told me. And the discussion was exactly about making assumptions or not about the findings of on anthropology or psychology or so on. And and I go back to method now. On one side, it is important to make assumptions and to collect to make abstractions and give an generalization about the collection of findings you have. On the other side, we, the philosophers, tend too much to make abstract assumptions about human nature. And on this path of reality about where did the very idea of state of nature of human nature came, the fact that it didn't come from an empty space, but from a precise historical context is very important for me. And the fact that these equality and freedom ideas were historically grounded is very important. On the other side, it is important for me to make general assumptions on these findings. One last thing, in Spinoza's letters, there is a very important one about imagination. And it is theoretically very important, but also it is interesting because to describe what imagination is, Spinoza tells us about a nightmare he had the night before writing this letter. And the nightmare is, in my opinion, is worth a novel, because it is about a scary figure of a black man from Pernambuco. And I asked myself, well, what is Pernambuco? And it came up that it was an isle where slaves had rebelled against the Portuguese, and got rid of their patrons, and got free. So it's just a note. I always wanted to write a novel about this Spinoza's nightmare, and this makes of my Spinoza a colonialist. But and this is also very interesting about the opposition between reason and the nightmare of our slaves, of our colonies. So that's all, folks.
Yeah, one of the things I love about the Graeber and Wengrow's method is that they really model what they say, and you can see, especially with the idea of there is no such thing as a single thinker, that, you know, all ideas come from all of us. And the way that they show that, they demonstrate that throughout the text, one, by the way that the text is written as a dialogue, where there are these section breaks where they say, you know, and in this section, the authors will lay out the following critique, etc. But they also show how Rousseau and Turgot were heavily influenced by Condillac and the others in ways that I don't think scholars up to this point have really examined as thoroughly as they have. They're absolutely right when they say that the response to this by Turgot and Rousseau was to say that that commercial societies with a more intense division of labor somehow, that those societies are inherently more progressive, that they're further along. What I like about this chapter is you can see how those sorts of conclusions or arguments that Rousseau and Turgot make didn't really pre-exist the indigenous critique. And that's sort of the way I've been in my own teaching, I've been really dismissive of European intellectuals because of their colonial status, because of how dismissive they were. But a more careful reading of European philosophers shows that no, that their answer to the indigenous critique was because of the indigenous critique, and not just simply a way around the indigenous critique, but it was a way to respond to and circumvent, rather than just being a display of some inherent European, some pre-existing European superiority or sense of superiority. That's what I've found. One of the things I've found so enriching about this chapter is that the Europeans, not only did they have people made sock puppets of the indigenous, but I think radical historians or anti-colonial historians have also made sock puppets out of some of these European intellectuals, without giving them without historicizing how these responses really did come about after 200 years of encounter. And so in my own teaching, I mean, one of the things that I'm going to try to do a better job at conveying is what the Europeans thought in 1493 versus what they thought in 1550, when some of the debates about indigenous humanity, whether all mankind was one, some of those had been settled, but the myth about the division of labor in commercial society hadn't been put forward as like the most effective critique. And so there really is a dialectical process that went on during those 200 years that I don't think historians of Europe or the Americas have adequately captured. And what I love about the method is that they're very transparent about their method in saying this method is a dialogic method. This is what a dialogue looks like. This is how ideas change as a result of that dialogue. And so you get to see it playing out in the form of an argument in a book.
I say something?
Yes.
A little bit. I just want to make I remember when I was, the first time I heard about the Articles of Confederation, well, I was just a boy. And it said this strange thing. It said it was based upon a previous confederation, which of course was the Iroquois Confederation. And I never understood, well, but I never knew what those Articles of Confederation were, those Iroquois ones. And that was something, it was like a side note that I never had a framework to put it into. Well, now I've got one, And I was just wondering, those of you who have read the book, I'm reading what has been sent to me, and I'm enjoying it immensely, of course. But I wonder whether he mentions that the Articles of Confederation at some point. I'll find out, I think, in the future. One other small point I wanted to make was this, that, you know, sometimes I have felt the need of the footnotes, because there were points where I think he would have given the source. I should be saying they. I keep saying he, and Steve is right to insist on a they. Okay, I'm going to correct myself on that, because as Simona was pointing out, this man was a collaborator. David was evidently a collaborator and someone who would think in concert with others. So I ask your forgiveness for this, but I understand that, and I stand corrected. But no, I was just wondering whether it would, I suppose it might be difficult to do this, but sometimes I have felt the need of the footnotes so I could be, you know, one thing I do is I try to read very critically. I found some points where I would have some objections or some questions. I won't bring them up because we're discussing things on another level. But it's not because I'm unfriendly to my text. It's simply because I want to be as demanding of the text as the text is of me. And when I first read Marx, I was an anti-communist, of course. And since then, I've had a certain evolution. But when I read Marx, one of the things I did, I read him to disprove him, you know, because I said, this guy isn't going to pull any wool over my eyes, I can tell you that. And I went over all his mathematics to see whether his mathematics was right. I used to have those notebooks, they're just incredible. And I found his mathematics, and I came away with this grudging admiration. I was still an anti-communist. Everyone I knew was an anti-communist in the 1950s. It was McCarthyism. You know, we didn't have that much autonomy of thought. I'm not trying to ask for forgiveness. I'm saying it's understandable. But, you know, and I came with this grudging admiration. I says, this guy wants to be understood. The subject is difficult. His words are that you have to spend some time on it. But this he wants to be.
Try to turn the video off, Gordon. We've lost you. No.
Reading away made me also understand.
Gordon, we cannot hear you. You're frozen.
Yeah.
We've lost him.
Yeah, the footnotes are in the
I think I'm back.
Version of the book.
Welcome back, Gordon.
I'll ask
Thank you.
Nika. I'll ask Nika if she can make a separate PDF of the footnotes that we can send out, because I agree it would, you know, the footnotes. I mean, you know, I think all of us here were probably footnote readers, so I know I am. Yeah. Like the footnotes. Yeah, I sometimes will freak my students out because I'll read a book. They'll hand me a book and I'll tell them what it's about by just reading the footnotes and not reading the book itself. And, because that's usually that, I mean, that's where the bodies are buried. So, so yeah, I'll see if I can get her to her son is I think knows how to work PDFs better than I do, and see if he can maybe break it in. He's the one who broke it into the separate chapters so we can now email it, because it's a huge file that I can't even, it's too large to email because it's too many megabytes. So I will ask her about that.
Thank you.
So other thoughts. I want to be mindful of the time. We've already gone over an hour. Not sure if people had additional things they wanted to add. So would you like to stick with the same plan in 2 weeks? Try chapter 3?
I sure would, speaking
Okay.
for myself.
All right. So the chapter 3 is I think it's called Unfreezing the Ice Age.
Sorry,
Yes.
Freezing the ice age.
I was not clear tonight. Did we discuss the introduction or Wicked Liberty, the first chapter? I was discussing both, actually.
Yeah, so our last session, so our very first session, we did chapter 2, and then we opted to go back and kind of start over with 1. And then this week was 2, but there's so much overlap between 1 and 2, because he's really trying to make, I think they're using chapter 2 to establish the premise about how history, in the sense of recorded history, like as a discipline, as a social science, has been wrong, just as so much of prehistory has been wrong. And so they use chapter 1 and 2 to sort of clear the field so that they can then start writing what they think is the new history of humanity. And that's what chapter 3 takes up, is I'm trying to bring it up here. It's called Unfreezing the Ice
The
Age.
ice age, okay.
Yeah, and what they try to do in chapter 3 is rethink they go off of the archaeological record and a lot of the recent research over the last 15 years that only specialists know, that paints a very different picture of humans during the prehistoric period. And that so that they try to do 2 things in the chapter. The first is to show that if there was an original first society, that very first society had a culture, and that culture was itself a political project. So they want to dispense entirely with the idea that just because Neolithic people didn't have the technologies that we don't today doesn't mean that they didn't have rich political imaginations that could construe alternate universes. So that's the first point they want to make, is that any kind of culture is itself a political project, but that history, the way it's been taught by Europeans, is usually people didn't start thinking historically until the French Revolution, when they realized they could make a difference. They could rise up en masse and make social movements. And then what they try to establish by going back to the Ice Age is one, that the very first culture was a political project, and that two, people were always coming in and out of hierarchies. And that just because a hierarchy was created doesn't mean that it persisted, and that people put up barriers to prevent hierarchies from becoming solidified. And so that is, and they, they go back 100,000 years to start their history. So that is, if that sounds good, we can meet. I'm looking for my calendar here. And on the 15th.
13th. I think it's a Wednesday is the 13th, is it not?
No, it's 14
1
days from now.
14 is 15.
Yeah.
Yeah, I show up the 15th.
15th is a Friday, isn't it? I'm getting this
No.
wrong probably. Okay,
Yeah.
I give up.
So
Does that
tomorrow,
sound good?
yeah.
So I will
Tomorrow
also,
it makes 1 year from since.
yeah, that's
it's,
right, 1 year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's. I just wanted to recall it.
Yeah. Okay, so the 15th, I will send out either later tonight or tomorrow morning, chapter 3 with just the particulars, just so that you have it. And then I'll ask Nika about the footnotes, because that would be wonderful. I agree.
And we agreed in the Museum of Care reading group to have a reading group about Spinoza next week on the 9th of September.
Right. Okay.
But I had to get an agreement on this with Vasily, and I still had no time to have a talk with him, but in principle, it's confirmed.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I want to join that.
Yeah.
Definitely want to be a part of that.
I'm not sure I do remember anything about now, but okay, I'll do my best.
I would imagine you've forgotten more than I've ever known about Spinoza, so I wouldn't worry.
Okay.
All right, so good seeing everyone, and
Thank you.
yeah, we'll be in touch.
Right.
Bye.
Take
Okay.
care.
Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
They say